Remember history class? Posters of Jefferson, quotes from Lincoln, and a teacher who swore the Founding Fathers were flawless? Yeah, none of it holds up under actual facts. Let's fix that. Columbus discovered America. You're told he sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and poof, America! But here's the part your school skipped. Christopher Columbus never discovered America. Not even close. The guy landed in the Bahamas thinking he'd hit Asia, called the people Indians, and never figured out he was on a completely different continent. And it gets dumber. On his first trip, he bounced around the Caribbean like a confused tourist. He set foot on islands we now call Hispaniola and Cuba, but not North America. Not once. 0 steps on what's now the U.S. Also, Columbus was not the first European to get there. That badge goes to Leif Erikson, a Viking who showed up in Newfoundland around the year 1000, almost 500 years earlier. The Vikings even set up a small camp at a place we now call Lonso Meadows. Columbus wasn't a pioneer, he was late. Still, schools painted him as a hero, holding a flag and planting civilization. What they didn't say: Columbus enslaved the locals, cut off hands if they didn't bring him enough gold, and helped launch centuries of genocide. His own men reported it. In fact, Spanish authorities arrested him in 1500 for being so brutal, and dragged him back to Spain in chains. Hero moment? Not quite. And just to twist the knife, he died thinking he found Asia. 4 voyages, multiple islands, no clue. Without maps, pure vibes and violence. But every October, school kids still celebrate Columbus Day, as if he gifted us Wi-Fi and pizza. Never mind the millions of indigenous people who were already here, living in complex societies, farming, building cities, and not asking to be discovered. So, no, Columbus didn't find America. He just crashed into it, lied about it, and left a trail of destruction so large we're still cleaning it up. Yet somehow, the textbooks forgot to mention that. Now say it with me. Lost. Wrong. Brutal. Arrested. Still got a holiday. Next time someone calls him a discoverer, ask them, "You sure he wasn't just really bad at maps?" The first Thanksgiving wasn't what you think. You were probably taught that in 1621, the Pilgrims and Native Americans came together, held hands, passed the gravy, and invented Thanksgiving. Nice story. Too bad it's mostly fiction. Here's what really happened. The Pilgrims didn't even call it Thanksgiving. They were holding a 3-day harvest party. There was food, sure, venison, corn, eel, and whatever else they didn't burn. But no turkey, no pies, no mashed potatoes, and absolutely no cranberry sauce unless you like it straight up bitter. The native guests? They weren't invited like friendly neighbors. The Wampanoag showed up with about 90 warriors, probably because they heard gunfire and thought the Pilgrims were preparing for war. It wasn't, "Let's feast together," but was more like, "Let's make sure we're not under attack." The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, had agreed to an uneasy peace treaty with the Pilgrims. Why? His people had been devastated by European diseases brought by earlier explorers. Up to 90% of New England's native population had already died from smallpox, leaving the Wampanoag weak and surrounded by enemies. Aligning with the newcomers was strategic survival, not a hallmark moment. And after that first Thanksgiving, things fell apart fast. Just 16 years later, the Pequot Massacre happened. English settlers burned a native village and slaughtered over 500 people, mostly women and children. Governor John Winthrop declared a day of Thanksgiving for the victory. That's right, a Thanksgiving to celebrate a massacre. But schools skipped that part. Instead, they gave us coloring sheets of smiling pilgrims and feathered natives sharing corn like besties. Meanwhile, the actual history was filled with land theft, broken treaties, and brutal violence. Oh, and the modern holiday? It didn't become official until 1863 during the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln declared a national Thanksgiving to boost morale. So the whole thing is less authentic tradition and more 19th century rebranding. Bottom line, that warm, fuzzy Thanksgiving tale, whitewashed, sanitized, served up with a side of revisionist gravy. The real story is messier, darker, and way less polite. Paul Revere didn't ride alone. You've heard the tale. Paul Revere galloped through the night yelling, "The British are coming," and single-handedly saved America, right? Wrong. That story's mostly made up, and it came from a poem. Let's start with the yelling part. Revere never shouted, "The British are coming." That would have been pointless. Most colonists still thought of themselves as British. What he likely said was something duller but more accurate, like, "The regulars are out." Not quite poster material. Also, Paul Revere didn't ride alone. He wasn't even the first choice. He was one of 3 riders sent out to warn the militias: Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott. Of the 3, guess who actually finished the job? Prescott. Revere got captured by British troops, questioned and released. But his horse got taken, and that was the end of his ride. Dawes made it further but got thrown off his horse. Prescott, a local doctor, was the only one who actually made it to Concord to spread the warning. But Revere got the fame. Why? A guy named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a dramatic poem in 1861, and it left everyone else out. The poem turned Revere into a solo superhero and skipped the part where he failed the mission. Even better, Revere didn't start the night with a heroic leap into action. First, he stopped at a tavern. Then he waited for a signal, 2 lanterns in the Old North Church, to confirm how the British were moving. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Dramatic? Yes. Fast? Not really. This was coordinated messaging, not a wild midnight dash. Revere was important. He helped organize the alarm system and got partway to Lexington. But the whole 1 man, 1 horse, 1 heroic warning line? Total rewrite. And yet, classrooms still hand out worksheets with Paul Revere blazing across Boston like an action hero. No Dawes, no Prescott. Just the guy who got caught and lost his horse. So let's recap. He didn't ride alone. He didn't shout that line. He didn't finish the trip. He wasn't even the main success of the night. But sure, let's give him the statue. The Declaration wasn't signed on July 4. Let's settle this. July 4, 1776, is not the day the Founding Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence. But hey, don't let that ruin your fireworks. Here's what really happened. On July 2, the Continental Congress voted to break away from Britain. John Adams even wrote to his wife that July 2nd would be celebrated with pomp and parade from this time forward forevermore. Oops. 2 days later, on July 4th, Congress finalized the text of the Declaration. That's the date they put on the document. But nobody signed anything that day. 0 pens hit parchment. The actual signing didn't start until August 2. And even then, some guys weren't present. A few signed months later, and some weren't even there in July at all. You know that famous painting by John Trumbull, the one showing Jefferson handing the Declaration to John Hancock in a packed room of well-dressed revolutionaries? Total fantasy. That moment never happened. Half of the people in that painting weren't even in Philadelphia at the same time. Also, the version most people think of, the big one with the bold John Hancock signature, that's not the original. That's the engrossed copy, written neatly by hand later for formal display. The real original? A rough draft full of edits, crossouts, and coffee stain energy. And let's not ignore the irony. Many of the men who signed that document calling for freedom and equality were slave owners, including Jefferson himself. 1/3 of the signers owned slaves. Independence was declared, sure, but not for everyone. Still, schools parade the idea that 56 brave men gathered on July 4 and boldly signed their names beneath, "We hold these truths." Like it was a group project turned in on time, it wasn't. It was more like a slow-motion roll call with political drama, travel delays, and missing signatures. Even Thomas McKean didn't sign until well into 1777. Talk about a late submission. Now ask your history teacher, do late signatures still count if there's a parade? Slavery wasn't just a Southern problem. Your textbook probably pinned slavery on the South like it was a regional personality flaw. Southern plantations, cotton fields, whips, chains, yep, all real. But here's the twist they left out. The North was in on it too. Big time. Let's talk facts. New York had slaves. So did Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Northern slavery existed for over 150 years. New Jersey held on so long it had people legally enslaved until 1865. That's the same year the Civil War ended, not a typo. But wait, didn't the North abolish slavery? Technically yes, but it wasn't instant. It was slow, messy, and full of loopholes. States passed gradual emancipation laws that kept people in bondage for decades. In Pennsylvania, kids born to enslaved mothers after 1780 were still forced to serve until age 28. That's not freedom. That's rebranded slavery. Even after slavery was phased out, Northern money loved Southern cotton. New England textile mills ran on it. Wall Street banks financed plantations and insured slave ships. Ivy League schools like Harvard and Brown took donations from slave owners and built endowments off that wealth. Meanwhile, the South did the dirty work, and the North cashed the checks. And let's not forget the ships. Rhode Island alone was responsible for over 1,000 slave voyages. Northern merchants weren't just watching, they were steering. The narrative that the North fought to end slavery is half true at best. Sure, many Northerners opposed it. Some risked their lives in the Underground Railroad. But others fought the Civil War not to free slaves, but to preserve the Union. Lincoln himself said in 1862, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." Ouch. So while your textbook framed it as a South versus North morality showdown, the truth's way uglier. The North wasn't clean, it was just less obvious. Lincoln didn't actually free all the slaves. Cue the dramatic music. January 1, 1863. Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. And just like that, freedom. Except, not really. Let's break it down. The Emancipation Proclamation declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Sounds powerful, right? Here's the catch. Lincoln didn't control the Confederacy. He was telling other people's slaves they were free, in places where the U.S. government had zero power at the time. It's like telling your neighbor's cat it no longer has to follow house rules. Looks bold on paper, means nothing in practice. Meanwhile, slavery stayed fully legal in the Union-loyal states: Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri. These were slave states that didn't join the Confederacy, so Lincoln left them alone. Gotta keep the Allies happy, right? The proclamation specifically excluded those areas. Slavery also continued in Union-occupied parts of Louisiana, Tennessee, and Virginia. You know, the parts the North did control. So no, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't instantly free 4 million people. In fact, it freed no one on day one. What it did do was turn the war into a moral fight. Before that, Lincoln made it clear he was fighting to save the Union, not to end slavery. The proclamation shifted the goalposts, and it kept European powers like Britain and France from siding with the South, because they couldn't openly support slavery. Lincoln was a smart guy, not a magic wand. He knew the proclamation was a political weapon, not a final blow. He pushed for the 13th Amendment, which finally abolished slavery nationwide in December 1865, 8 months after he was assassinated. And here's a spicy footnote. Even after slavery ended, thousands of black Americans were forced back into labor through black codes, vagrancy laws, and prison labor schemes. Freedom on paper didn't mean safety, rights, or dignity. It just meant a new kind of fight had begun. But your school probably skipped that nuance and gave you a nice image of Lincoln, top hat and all, freeing everyone with a single signature. They forgot to mention that most enslaved people didn't even hear about it for months or years, some not until Union troops marched in with the news. The Wild West wasn't that wild. Hollywood told you the Wild West was a non-stop gunfight. Cowboys and shootouts, outlaws robbing banks, saloon doors swinging every 5 minutes. Spoiler, it was mostly boring. Let's start with the classic image: duels in the street at high noon. In reality, public shootouts were extremely rare. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral? It lasted 30 seconds, involved 9 guys, and happened because everyone was drunk and mad. That's it. Not a daily event, more like a one-off meltdown. Also, most towns had strict gun laws. That's right. In Dodge City, Kansas and Tombstone, Arizona, you had to check your guns with the sheriff when you rode in. Imagine walking into a Wild West town and getting hit with a no guns allowed sign. Lawless? Not exactly. Crime? There was some, sure, but it wasn't the chaos you see on screen. Homicide rates were lower in many frontier towns than in modern cities. Deadwood, South Dakota, had fewer murders than present-day Chicago. And it wasn't because people were behaving. It was because law enforcement existed, and towns depended on order to survive. No one wanted to run a saloon next to a shootout every Tuesday. Cowboys? They weren't all white, all tough, or all armed. About 1 in 4 cowboys were black, and many were Mexican or native. Most weren't gunslingers. They were livestock workers doing long, sweaty, underpaid jobs. They weren't chasing bandits. They were chasing cows across the plains for 12 hours a day. Glamorous? Not really. But it paid the bills. And those outlaws we romanticize? A lot of them were petty thieves or stagecoach robbers. Billy the Kid? He killed maybe 8 people total, not hundreds. Jesse James? More of a political terrorist than a lovable rebel. These guys got mythologized later when newspapers and dime novels exaggerated everything to sell stories. Think of it as 19th century clickbait. The Wild West wasn't wild. It was a marketing strategy. The real West had railroads, farmers, merchants, women, laws, and churches. People were trying to build lives, not live inside a spaghetti western. Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb. Your textbook probably crowned Thomas Edison as the genius who lit up the world. Boom, light bulb. Except, here's the truth, Edison didn't invent it. He just made a better version and took the credit. Let's rewind. The idea of electric light had been around since the early 1800s. In 1802, British chemist Humphrey Davy created the first electric arc lamp. Then came Warren de la Rue in 1841, who used platinum wire to make a bulb. Still no Edison. Fast forward to Joseph Swan, another Brit. In 1878, he filed a patent in the UK for a working incandescent bulb using carbonized paper filament. Sound familiar? It should. Because Edison's version in 1879 used nearly the same concept. When Swan found out, he sued Edison for patent infringement and won in British court. So what did Edison actually do? he made a longer-lasting, more commercially practical version. His real skill wasn't invention, it was improvement and marketing. He had a team of over 30 engineers and researchers at Menlo Park cranking out ideas around the clock. Basically, Edison ran an invention factory. He was less lone genius and more CEO of bright ideas. And he didn't stop at the light bulb. Edison also built the infrastructure. Power stations, wiring systems, meters, the stuff needed to make electric light work in actual homes. That's a big deal. But inventing the bulb from scratch? He didn't. Also, Edison wasn't exactly a nice guy. He once electrocuted animals in public just to make Nikola Tesla's AC current look dangerous. He turned scientific rivalry into circus acts. Imagine showing up to a science fair and frying an elephant. That was Edison's vibe. Back to the light bulb. The truth is, many people contributed to its invention. It took decades of work, trial, error, and burned-out filaments. Edison just happened to be the guy who packaged it right, got the patents, and made sure you remembered his name. But schools simplified it. One man, one idea, one glowing bulb over his head. Neat, but false. The 19th Amendment didn't give all women the right to vote. Textbooks loved to cheer. In 1920, women finally got the right to vote. Cue the parade, the sashes, the Susan B. Anthony coins. But here's the part they skipped. That victory was only partial. If you were white, middle class, and lived in the right place, congratulations. If not, good luck at the polls. Let's start with the 19th Amendment itself. It says the right to vote can't be denied on the basis of sex. That's it. Nothing about race, nothing about citizenship loopholes, nothing about Jim Crow. So while white women rushed to register in 1920, many Black, Latina, Native, and Asian women were still blocked by design. In the South, officials used the same dirty tricks that kept Black men from voting: poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and outright violence. That didn't magically stop when women got the vote. It just meant Black women got a double dose of suppression. People like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell fought tooth and nail for the vote and kept getting shut down long after 1920. Native American women? They weren't even considered U.S. citizens until 1924, thanks to the Indian Citizenship Act. And even then, states found excuses to block them. In Arizona and New Mexico, it took until the 1940s for them to legally vote. So much for universal suffrage. Asian American women? Also blocked. The U.S. didn't allow most Asian immigrants to become naturalized citizens until 1952. And without citizenship, no vote. Doesn't matter what the 19th Amendment said, if you weren't considered a real American, you weren't getting near a ballot box. And Puerto Rican women? They gained limited voting rights in 1935, but full rights didn't come until 1937, and even then, they had to meet literacy requirements. So no, the 19th Amendment didn't give women the vote. It removed one legal barrier and left all the others intact. But your textbook probably ended the story with white suffragettes smiling in black and white photos. Mission accomplished. Meanwhile, millions of women were still locked out of democracy for decades. So next time someone says, women got the vote in 1920, ask them, which women? The U.S. did not win the Vietnam War. Here's the lie they slipped into your history book. America went to Vietnam, fought the communists, and came home stronger. Translation? We lost. Badly. Let's start with the basics. The Vietnam War dragged on for 20 years, cost over 58,000 American lives, and left millions of Vietnamese dead. The goal? Stop the spread of communism. The result? Vietnam became fully communist by 1975. That's not a win. That's a faceplant. In school, they might have told you the U.S. pulled out honorably. What really happened? In 1973, the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords and left the South Vietnamese government to fend for itself. 2 years later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. South Vietnam fell. The last Americans evacuated from the U.S. Embassy by helicopter, in full panic mode. Very heroic. And let's talk strategy. The U.S. military dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than in all of World War II combined. Villages were wiped out. Forests were torched with Agent Orange, a chemical so toxic it still causes birth defects. All that firepower and still, the U.S. couldn't defeat guerrilla fighters in sandals. Back home, Americans were watching the war on TV and hating it. By the late 1960s, public support collapsed. Protests exploded. Soldiers came back wounded, traumatized, and often blamed for a war they didn't start. There were no parades and victory speeches. There was only confusion and silence. The U.S. government tried to spin it. They called it a conflict, not a war. They talked about peace with honor, but the truth was in the photos. Burning villages, dead civilians, body bags stacked on the tarmac. Oh, and here's a fun fact. Vietnam wasn't even America's war to begin with. The US jumped in after France got kicked out in 1954. We backed a shaky South Vietnamese regime, ignored its corruption, and kept pouring money into a hole labeled quagmire. So, did the US win in Vietnam? Absolutely not. The Vietnamese won. The North took over, and the country was reunified under communism. But try finding that sentence in your high school history book. Most just quietly changed the subject after the chapter on JFK. If that wasn't a loss, why were Americans evacuating Saigon by helicopter under enemy fire? Dress it up however you want, it still looks like defeat.